The blood on my hands was still warm when he said the name. 6 hours. That was all the time I had with the dying man on my table. Chest trauma, failing vitals, eyes that kept finding mine like he was searching for something. Thomas. He whispered it through the oxygen mask. Tell him I'm sorry. Should have been faster. My breath stopped. Thomas was my husband's name, my dead husband's name. I saved him anyway, stitched every wound, fought for every heartbeat. He died at dawn. 2 weeks later, his lawyer handed me a check for $43 million. I had never seen this man before that night. Or had I? The fluorescent lights in County General's emergency room buzzed like dying insects. Sarah Garrett had stopped noticing them years ago. 3 years of night shifts would do that. 3 years of keeping her head down. 3 years of pretending she didn't hear the whispers that followed her through the hospital corridors like smoke. November cold pressed against the windows. The ER was understaffed again. 2 nurses for the entire floor. 1 attending physician already buried in surgery. Sarah checked her watch. 10:47 p.m. Daniel would be asleep by now, her mother watching him in their cramped apartment. School clothes laid out for morning, lunch packed, the careful architecture of survival. The ambulance bay doors slammed open at 11 exactly. Paramedics wheeled in a gurney at speed. Male patient, 40s maybe, car accident on the interstate, chest trauma, massive internal bleeding. His shirt was cut away. Blood everywhere. Too much blood. John Doe. No ID, no family, just a man dying on her table. The attending was still in surgery. Sarah was alone. Just her and Kelly, a nurse barely out of school. The kind of alone that could end a career if things went wrong. The kind that had already ruined her reputation once. Sarah pushed the thought away, focused on hands, on breath, on the next 60 seconds. She worked fast, IV lines in both arms, fluids running. Kelly hung blood bags with shaking fingers. Sarah's hands moved through familiar patterns. Pressure here, clamp there, the rhythm of emergency medicine, the dance between life and death. The patient's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching. His chest heaved with effort, pulse thready, blood pressure dropping. Sarah called for medication, more fluids, her voice steady even as her mind calculated odds, calculated how long before the choice became inevitable. Save him or watch him slip away. His hand shot out, grabbed her wrist, weak grip but desperate, urgent. Sarah looked down. His eyes locked onto her name badge. Sarah Garrett. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, shock, relief maybe, or regret. His lips moved. Sarah leaned closer. His breath rattled. Thomas. The word came out broken. Wet. Like it had been trapped inside him for years. Tell him I tried. Should have been faster. Sarah's hand stopped. Just for a second. Just long enough for the world to tilt sideways. Thomas was her husband's name. Her dead husband's name. The name she heard in nightmares. The name that haunted every whispered conversation in this hospital. Margaret was right. The patient's eyes were closing again. Consciousness slipping. I was a coward. Margaret. Thomas's sister. The woman who blamed Sarah for the accident. Who said Sarah had distracted him. Who made sure the whole town knew. Who turned a widow into a scandal. Sarah's breath came short. Her hands trembled against the gurney rail. This man knew Thomas, knew Margaret, knew things he shouldn't know, couldn't know. Unless. Kelly touched her shoulder. Dr. Garrett, his pressure is dropping. Sarah snapped back, pushed the questions down, buried them deep. There would be time later, if he lived, if she could keep him breathing long enough to demand answers. She fought harder. Transfusions, medications, chest compressions when his heart stuttered, IV pushes, intubation. Sarah worked through the golden hour, then the second hour, The third. Her scrubs soaked through with his blood, her arms burning, her voice hoarse from calling orders. Kelly moved like Sarah's shadow, anticipating, adapting. Together they built a wall between the patient and death. 4 hours, 5. The sky outside went from black to gray. Dawn crept toward the windows. The attending finally appeared at 5 a.m., Dr. Morrison, older, competent. He took one look at the patient and raised his eyebrows. Sarah gave report in clipped sentences, vitals stabilizing, bleeding controlled, patient critical but alive. Morrison nodded. Good work. Go home. You look like hell. Sarah stepped into the hallway. Let the door swing shut behind her. Her legs shook. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She'd kept him alive. 6 hours. Alone. She'd pulled him back from the edge. And he knew her husband's name. The code alarm sounded at dawn. Sarah heard it from the break room where she was washing blood from her arms. Heard the rush of feet, the sharp commands, the flat line tone that meant someone's time had run out. She already knew. Somehow she knew. Kelly found her 10 minutes later. Eyes red. He didn't make it. Coded at 6:14. Morrison called it. Sarah nodded. Dried her hands. Felt nothing. Felt everything. Kelly hesitated. No ID on him. Just an expensive watch. Business card in his jacket pocket. Michael Cole. Some kind of CEO. Michael Cole. The name meant nothing. A stranger. A ghost. A man who died whispering her dead husband's name. Sarah drove home through morning traffic, unlocked the apartment door, found Daniel eating cereal at the kitchen table, her mother drinking coffee. Normal life. Safe life. Daniel ran to her. Mom, you're home. You smell like hospital. Sarah held him, breathed him in, 7 years old. Thomas's eyes, her stubborn chin, the only good thing left from that marriage. She didn't tell him about the patient, about the whispered name, about the way a stranger had looked at her like he'd been searching his whole life and finally found what he was looking for. Some ghosts were better left alone. 2 weeks crawled by like wounded animals. Sarah worked double shifts, picked up every extra hour the hospital would give her. Daniel needed new shoes, his toes pressed against the worn fabric. The soles were separating. She'd glued them twice already. The bills sat on her kitchen counter in careful stacks. Hospital charges from when Daniel had pneumonia last winter. Payment plans stretched thin as spider silk. Insurance that covered almost nothing. She was drowning, but drowning slowly, drowning quietly, the way she'd learned to do everything. The ER became her refuge, familiar chaos, bleeding patients and broken bones, problems she could solve with her hands, questions that had answers. She didn't think about Michael Cole, refused to think about him, about the way he'd grabbed her wrist, about Thomas's name in his dying breath. Some mysteries were better left buried. The man in the expensive suit appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was restocking supply cabinets when Kelly found her. Someone asking for you. In the waiting room. Looks official. He stood near the vending machines. Tall. 50, maybe. Gray at the temples. Suit that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. He had a leather briefcase and the careful posture of someone who lived in courtrooms. Sarah Garrett? His voice was smooth, professional. He extended a hand. Jonathan Webb. I represent the estate of Michael Cole. The name hit like a fist. Sarah's mouth went dry. She shook his hand automatically, her nurse training kicking in. Smile. Be polite. Don't show weakness. Is there somewhere we can talk? Webb glanced around the waiting room. Somewhere private? The cafeteria was nearly empty. Late afternoon lull. Sarah bought coffee she wouldn't drink. Webb ordered nothing. They sat at a corner table, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Webb opened his briefcase, pulled out a folder, slid it across the table with practiced ease. Michael Cole's last will and testament, revised the morning of his accident. He paused. Everything goes to you. Sarah stared at the papers. Legal words swimming, her name repeated. Sarah Garrett, physician assistant, County General Hospital. The specificity was unsettling. I don't understand. Her voice sounded far away. I didn't know him. Mr. Cole was very specific. Webb's tone was neutral, professional. He called his attorney that morning, made the changes over the phone, seemed urgent. He knew your full name, where you worked. He wanted you to have everything. Everything. The word hung in the air like smoke. Webb continued. $43 million in liquid assets, 2 properties, investment portfolios, stock holdings, all transferred to your name upon his death. The room tilted. Sarah gripped the table edge. This is a mistake. I treated him for 6 hours. He was a patient, a stranger. He knew who you were. Webb tapped the folder. The changes were legal. Witnessed. Notarized. This is his final wish. Behind them, a tray clattered. Sarah turned, saw Dr. Morrison at the coffee station, watching them, his expression unreadable. Her stomach dropped. By end of shift, everyone knew. The whispers started in the break room, spread through the ER like infection. Sarah heard fragments, saw the looks, felt the judgment crystallize around her like ice. She must have known him. Why else would he leave her everything? Probably an affair? Rich man? Struggling single mother? Do the math. Maybe she was his mistress, playing the poor widow while collecting money on the side. Gold digger, using her dead husband's memory to manipulate a dying rich man. Sarah kept her head down, finished her charts, avoided eye contact. The walls were closing in. Her supervisor called her at 7 p.m. Sarah, we need to talk. The office was small, cramped. Her supervisor, Linda, sat behind a desk buried in paperwork. Her face was tight, uncomfortable. Sarah, you know I respect you. Linda's words came careful, measured. But this situation, the inheritance, it raises questions. I didn't know him. Sarah's voice was steady, flat. I treated him like any other patient, I believe you. Linda didn't meet her eyes. But the hospital has protocols, ethics standards. We need to investigate, make sure there was no preferential treatment, no prior relationship. There wasn't. Then you have nothing to worry about. Linda folded her hands. But until we complete the investigation, I'm putting you on leave. Paid. Just temporary. The words landed like stones. Leave meant guilty until proven innocent. Leave meant everyone would believe the worst. Sarah left the hospital at 8 p.m., drove home in silence. The city lights blurred past her windows. Margaret was waiting on her doorstep. Thomas's sister looked older, harder. 3 years of grief had carved lines into her face. She stood when Sarah approached, arms crossed, expression cold. You have some nerve. Margaret's voice shook. My brother is barely cold and you're collecting money from strange men? Sarah unlocked the door, tried to move past. Margaret blocked her path. $43 million. Margaret spat the words. From a patient you claim you didn't know. Do you think I'm stupid? I didn't know him. Liar. Margaret's face twisted. You dishonor Thomas's memory. Use his death to manipulate wealthy men. What kind of mother does that? Sarah's hands clenched. Get out of my way. I'm filing for custody. Margaret stepped closer. Daniel deserves better than a mother who profits from death. Better than whatever you've become. The threat hung between them. Real. Possible. Margaret had money, connections, a respectable life. Sarah had scandal and $43 million she never asked for. Margaret left. Sarah stood in the hallway, shaking, keys cutting into her palm. Inside, her mother was reading to Daniel. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Sarah watched them through the doorway, her son's face relaxed, trusting, unaware that his world was cracking apart. After Daniel fell asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the lawyer's card in front of her. Jonathan Webb, estate attorney, a phone number that could answer questions. $43 million. From a man she'd fought to save. Who died anyway? Who knew Thomas's name? Who whispered apologies meant for a ghost? She needed answers. Needed to understand why Michael Cole had chosen her. Why he'd destroyed her life with generosity she never wanted. But seeking answers meant admitting the inheritance was real, meant accepting that connection existed. However impossible, however damning, and that might cost her everything, her job, her reputation, her son. Sarah turned off the lights, sat in darkness, the lawyer's card a pale rectangle on the table. Outside, the city breathed, indifferent, cold, waiting to see what she would do. Sarah called Jonathan Webb at midnight, her voice steady despite shaking hands. I'm not accepting the inheritance. Not until I understand why he left it to me. Webb was quiet for a long moment. Ms. Garrett, rejecting the estate, opens it to legal challenges. Mr. Cole has distant relatives, cousins, a nephew. They're already contesting the will. If you refuse, they'll claim it. Let them. Sarah's jaw tightened. I need to know who Michael Cole was, why he knew my husband, why he died saying Thomas's name. That's not my area of expertise. Webb's tone shifted. Careful. But I can tell you Mr. Cole was very deliberate. He wanted you to have this. Then he should have told me why. She hung up, opened her laptop, started searching. Michael Cole. The internet gave her pieces, Forbes articles, business profiles, self-made millionaire who built Cole Logistics from nothing. Started as a warehouse worker, worked his way up, bought out his employer, expanded into 3 states, sold the company 5 years ago for an undisclosed sum, never married, no children, lived alone in a modest house despite his wealth, reputation for being brilliant but distant, avoided social events, declined interviews, a man who built an empire and then walked away from it. Sarah pulled Thomas's old papers from the hall closet, boxes she'd avoided for 3 years, his work history, pay stubs, a badge on a lanyard. Thomas had worked for Summit Shipping. 2 years, before they married, before Daniel. Sarah had barely known him then. She searched Summit Shipping, found acquisition records. Cole Logistics purchased Summit 7 years before Thomas died, absorbed the employees, consolidated divisions. Thomas and Michael had worked for the same company, different cities, different departments, but connected. Sarah called former Summit employees, numbers from old contact lists in Thomas's papers. Most didn't answer. 2 hung up when she mentioned Michael Cole's name. 1 agreed to meet, Ray Mitchell, warehouse manager. Retired now. He lived 40 minutes outside the city in a house that smelled like cigarettes and old coffee. Thomas Garrett. Ray nodded, slowly when Sarah showed him pictures. Good worker. Quiet. Kept to himself, mostly. Did you know Michael Cole? Ray's expression shifted. Uncomfortable. That was a long time ago. Please. Sarah leaned forward. I need to understand. There was an accident. Ray lit a cigarette. His hands weren't steady. Forklift malfunction. Someone got trapped under falling cargo. Thomas was on shift. So was a young supervisor, Michael Cole. What happened? Ray exhaled smoke. People got hurt. Nothing fatal that time. But Michael quit right after, just walked away, never came back. He seemed destroyed by something, like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. Sarah left with more questions than answers. Drove home through afternoon traffic, her mind spinning. She found another police report buried in online archives, 7 years old, Warehouse robbery. 2 workers attempted to stop the thieves. 1 died at the scene. Thomas Garrett. The other was injured. Name withheld. The report said an anonymous caller reported the incident. Male voice. Gave Thomas's location. Described his injuries. Then hung up before officers arrived. Sarah requested Thomas's autopsy report through her hospital credentials. Read it with fresh eyes. Professional eyes. Not a widow's eyes. Blunt force trauma to the head. Massive internal bleeding. Defensive wounds on his hands and forearms. But something else. Evidence of someone trying to move him. Fabric fibers under his nails. Skin cells. Someone had tried to pull him to safety. Someone had fought to save him. Failed. Left before help arrived. The pieces were connecting. Slowly. Painfully. Michael knew Thomas, worked with him, was there when he died, tried to save him, couldn't. The guilt destroyed him. He walked away from everything, built a fortune he didn't want. Searched for Thomas's widow. Left her everything as payment for a debt he could never repay. Margaret appeared at Sarah's apartment on a Thursday evening. No warning, no courtesy, just rage wrapped in expensive clothes. "You're still digging?" Margaret's voice was ice, still chasing this fantasy that justifies the money. It's not a fantasy. Sarah stood in the doorway, blocking her. Michael knew Thomas. They worked together. Convenient. Margaret shoved papers at her. Custody petition. Preliminary hearing scheduled. The inheritance proves you had inappropriate relationships. Proves you're morally unfit. Sarah took the papers, her hands steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "You can't take Daniel. Watch me." Margaret turned, walked away, left Sarah holding legal threats that could destroy everything. The hospital called the next morning. Linda's voice apologetic but firm. "Sarah, we're moving you to unpaid leave. The board wants a full ethics investigation. They're suggesting you might want to resign. Make this easier on everyone. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know." Linda sighed. "But perception matters. And right now the perception is damaging." Sarah hung up, sat at her kitchen table. Bills stacked high. Savings nearly gone. Job disappearing. Custody battle looming. Daniel found her there after school. "Mom, why do kids say mean things about you?" His voice was small. Scared. "They say you took money from a dead man. They say you're bad." Sarah pulled him close. "I'm not bad. I promise. Sometimes people don't understand. Sometimes the truth is complicated." But she didn't know the truth. Not all of it. Not enough. That night after Daniel slept, Sarah spread everything across the table. Employment records, police reports, autopsy findings, newspaper clippings, the pieces of a puzzle she was terrified to complete. Michael Cole had known Thomas, had been there when he died, had tried to save him, had failed, had spent 7 years carrying that guilt, building wealth, searching for redemption, for forgiveness. And then he'd found her. Sarah Garrett, the widow, the woman whose life he'd inadvertently destroyed. He'd left her everything because he had nothing else to give. Sarah was losing everything while chasing a ghost. Her job, her reputation, maybe her son. But she couldn't stop, because Michael Cole had died whispering her dead husband's name. And somewhere in that whisper was a truth that mattered more than money, more than scandal, more than fear. She just had to find it before everything fell apart. The warehouse stood at the edge of the industrial district, abandoned for 5 years. Graffiti covered the walls in layers. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth. Sarah parked across the street, stared at the building where her husband had died. She'd never come here before, never wanted to see it. But now she needed to walk the space, needed to feel what Michael had felt, understand what he'd seen. The front door hung loose on rusted hinges. Inside, the air smelled like decay and old motor oil. Empty shelves lined the walls. Concrete floor stained dark in places. Sarah walked slowly, her footsteps echoing, trying to imagine that night 7 years ago. Thomas had stood here, worked here, died here, and Michael had watched it happen. Sarah found the security company through old building records, made an appointment, told them she was family of a former employee, researching a potential lawsuit, worker safety violations. The clerk was young, bored, barely looked at her ID. We keep digital archives going back 10 years. He pulled up a database. What date? Sarah gave him the night Thomas died. The clerk clicked through files, uploaded footage to a viewing station, left her alone in a small room with a monitor and headphones. Sarah pressed play. The footage was grainy, black and white. Timestamp in the corner. 7 years ago. 11:47 p.m. 2 figures moved through the warehouse, doing inventory, checking shipments, their movements routine. Familiar. Thomas. Sarah recognized his walk, the way he carried himself. The other figure was smaller, younger, moving with nervous energy. At 12:03 a.m., breaking glass. Both men turned, voices off, camera, shouting. Thomas moved toward the sound. The other man followed, hesitant. 3 figures entered the frame, faces covered, carrying crowbars. Thomas stepped forward, hands up, saying something the camera couldn't capture. One of the intruders swung. Thomas went down hard, his head hitting concrete. The sound was silent on the footage, but Sarah felt it in her bones. The other man lunged forward. Michael. Sarah could see it now. Younger but recognizable. He tried to reach Thomas, got hit himself, stumbled, fell. The thieves grabbed boxes, ran, disappeared off camera. Michael crawled to Thomas, pulled at his shoulders, trying to move him. Thomas wasn't responding. Michael's mouth moved. Desperate words no one could hear. He pressed his hands against Thomas's head, blood seeping through his fingers. Michael pulled out his phone, dialed. His hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped it. He spoke into it, urgent, frantic. Then he looked up, saw something off camera. His whole body went still. He stood slowly, walked toward whatever he'd seen. The camera angle didn't follow. He disappeared from frame for 30 seconds. When he came back, his face was different, broken. He looked at Thomas one more time. Then he walked to the back exit. Left. Sirens approached 3 minutes later. Sarah watched the footage again, and again, trying to understand. Why would Michael leave? Why not stay? Why abandon Thomas? She requested police records, interview transcripts. The responding officers had noted an anonymous call. Male voice. Described the robbery. Gave Thomas's exact location. Said he thought someone was badly hurt. Then hung up before they could get a name. Officers arrived at 12:24 a.m., found Thomas exactly where the caller had described. Dead for approximately 8 minutes. Massive head trauma. No pulse. No breath. Sarah sat in the archives room, the pieces finally connecting. Michael had called for help, but Thomas was already gone. Already beyond saving. Michael had known it, had checked, had confirmed what he couldn't accept, that his co-worker, his friend maybe, was dead. And Michael blamed himself for not being faster, for not stopping the thieves, for not protecting Thomas, for being there and still failing. The guilt destroyed him. He quit his job, walked away from the company he'd built, from the life he'd known, carried Thomas's death like a stone in his chest. 7 years, building wealth he didn't want, searching for Thomas's family, finding Sarah, watching from a distance, making sure she and Daniel survived, never approaching, never explaining, just carrying the weight alone. The car accident. Sarah understood now. Michael had been driving to the hospital, finally ready to tell the truth. to face her, to apologize for failing her husband, to give her everything he had because he had nothing else to offer. He'd changed his will that morning, made sure she'd inherit, made sure his final act would be redemption even if he couldn't speak. The words. He died before he could explain. But he'd left her the answer. $43 million. Not a gift, an apology, a confession, a plea for forgiveness he'd never hear granted. Sarah sat in her car outside the abandoned warehouse, crying for the first time since Thomas died. Not for her husband. She'd grieved him years ago, made peace with his death, moved forward as much as anyone could. But she cried for Michael, a stranger who'd carried her pain alongside his own, who'd spent 7 years trying to atone for a death he couldn't prevent, who'd built a fortune from guilt, who'd died trying to make something right that could never be fixed. She understood the whispered apologies now, the recognition in his eyes, the desperate need. He'd been saying goodbye to Thomas, through the hands of the widow he'd been too afraid to face, seeking absolution from the woman he'd failed. Sarah drove home as the sun set, the lawyer's card still in her pocket. $43 million, blood money, guilt money, the currency of a broken man's last chance at peace. She didn't know if she could accept it, didn't know if taking it honored Michael or enabled his guilt. But she finally understood why he'd left it, understood the weight he'd carried, the price he'd paid for surviving when Thomas hadn't. The inheritance wasn't about money. It was about a man who couldn't forgive himself, who'd spent his last breath trying to earn forgiveness he'd never believed he deserved. And Sarah was the only one left who could grant it. Sarah walked into County General on a Monday morning, requested a meeting with the ethics board, her voice steady when she made the call. No apologies, no hesitation. Just a simple statement. I need to address the allegations against me. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday, conference room on the 3rd floor. Sarah arrived 10 minutes early, found the room already full. 5 board members sat along one side of the table, her supervisor, Linda, among them, the hospital administrator, Dr. Morrison, 2 lawyers in expensive suits. Margaret sat near the window, her own attorney beside her, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper smile. The room was hostile, cold. Sarah felt it the moment she entered, the weight of judgment, the presumption of guilt. She sat alone on the opposite side, placed her folder on the table, folded her hands, waited. The board chair spoke first. Ms. Garrett, we're here to address serious concerns regarding your professional conduct. The inheritance from patient Michael Cole raises questions about ethics violations, inappropriate relationships, potential abuse of your position. Sarah nodded. I understand. That's why I'm here. To explain. She opened her folder, pulled out documents, slid them across the table. Employment records showing Thomas and Michael worked for the same company. Police reports from the night Thomas died. Security footage, timestamps, autopsy findings. Michael Cole knew my husband. Sarah's voice was calm, clear. They worked together 15 years ago. Different divisions, but the same company. 7 years ago, my husband was killed during a warehouse robbery. Michael was there. He tried to save Thomas. He couldn't. The guilt destroyed him. She described the footage. Michael crawling to Thomas, calling for help, walking away before police arrived. The anonymous tip that led officers to Thomas's body. Michael spent 7 years carrying that guilt, building wealth he didn't want, searching for Thomas's family. He found me, watched from a distance, made sure Daniel and I survived, never approaching, never explaining, just trying to atone. Sarah looked at each board member. The car accident happened while he was driving to this hospital, to finally tell me the truth, to apologize. He changed his will that morning, left me everything because he had nothing else to give. He died before he could explain. But he made sure I'd understand eventually. Margaret's lawyer leaned forward. Convenient story, Ms. Garrett. You discover this elaborate connection only after inheriting millions? Her tone was acid. How do we know you didn't fabricate this evidence? Create this narrative to justify accepting dirty money? The security footage is from the company's archives. Sarah kept her voice level. The police reports are public record. The employment records are documented. You can verify everything. But you didn't know any of this when you treated him? The lawyer pressed. You expect us to believe you had no prior relationship? I didn't know him. Sarah met her eyes. I fought for 6 hours to save a stranger. That's what I do. That's my job. The board members whispered among themselves. Skeptical faces. Doubt written in every expression. Linda spoke, her voice regretful. Sarah, even if this is true, the scandal has damaged the hospital. Patients are requesting different providers. Staff morale is suffering. Several nurses have complained about the distraction. It might be easier if you resigned. For everyone. Easier for who? Sarah's jaw tightened. For you? For the hospital's reputation? Or for me? Before Linda could answer, Margaret stood. She placed papers on the table, pushed them toward the center. Custody petition. Margaret's voice was ice. Filed yesterday. My brother's son deserves stability. Deserves a mother whose judgment isn't compromised. Sarah's acceptance of this money violates medical ethics. Proves she's morally unfit. My husband and I can provide the home Daniel needs. She cannot. The words landed like stones. Sarah's breath caught. Her hands clenched under the table. The board chair cleared his throat. We'll schedule a formal hearing. 2 weeks from today. Ms. Garrett, you're suspended without pay until then. He paused. If you accept the inheritance before the hearing, we'll have no choice but to terminate your employment. The ethics violation would be clear. And the custody case would be strengthened, Margaret's lawyer added. Accepting money from a deceased patient demonstrates poor judgment. Prioritizing wealth over professional standards. No court would grant custody under those circumstances. Sarah looked at Margaret. Saw Thomas's sister. Saw grief turned to rage. Saw a woman who'd blamed Sarah for 3 years and now had legal grounds to take everything left. The choice was impossible. Accept the inheritance and lose Daniel. Reject it and let Michael's distant relatives claim the estate. Let his final act of redemption be undone. Let his apology go unanswered. 2 weeks, Sarah's savings would last 1. Maybe. Rent was due in 3 weeks. Daniel's school expenses, medical bills, the careful architecture of survival was collapsing. The meeting ended. Sarah left without speaking. Drove home in silence, found Daniel at the kitchen table doing homework, her mother making dinner. Normal life, safe life, fragile life. That night, Daniel crawled into her bed. Mom, are we going to be okay? His voice small. Scared. Kids at school say we're moving. Say I have to live with Aunt Margaret. Sarah held him. We're going to be okay, I promise. The lie tasted like ash. But some lies were necessary. Some promises had to be made even when you didn't know if you could keep them. The next morning, Sarah did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She drove to the cemetery, found Thomas's grave. Simple headstone. His name, his dates, nothing else. She stood in cold December wind, talked to him like he could hear. I need to know what to do. Her voice cracked. Michael tried to save you. Failed. Spent 7 years trying to make it right. Left me everything. But taking it might cost me Daniel. Rejecting it erases what Michael tried to do. The wind didn't answer. Dead men offered no wisdom. But standing there, Sarah realized she'd been asking the wrong question. This wasn't about money, wasn't about choosing between inheritance and survival. It was about truth, about standing in front of people who'd judged her for years, refusing to be ashamed, refusing to hide. She pulled out her phone. Called Jonathan Webb. "I'm accepting the inheritance." Her voice was steady. "Every penny. I'll face the board, face Margaret, face whoever I have to. Michael Cole gave his fortune to the woman who fought for him. Not because I knew him, because I tried anyway. That deserves honor, not rejection. Ms. Garrett, you understand the risks." "I understand. But I'm done being afraid." She hung up, stood at Thomas's grave a moment longer, then drove home. 2 weeks until the hearing. 2 weeks to find courage, to prepare not just evidence but herself, to learn how to stand up, be seen, let truth be enough. The ethics hearing room was packed when Sarah arrived. Hospital board members lined one side of the long table. Staff filled chairs along the walls. Patients she'd treated, nurses she'd worked with. Margaret sat front row with her lawyer. Local reporters clustered near the back, cameras ready, notebooks open. This was entertainment, scandal, a fallen woman getting what she deserved. Sarah entered alone. No lawyer, no support, just a folder of documents and a lifetime of being underestimated. She took her seat, felt every eye on her, felt the weight of judgment pressing down like stone. The board chair cleared his throat. "We're here to address serious allegations against Ms. Sarah Garrett, accepting inappropriate gifts from a patient, potential ethics violations, questions about her fitness to practice medicine." He paused. "There's also the matter of a custody petition filed by the deceased patient's family." The atmosphere shifted, became a courtroom, a trial, Sarah's entire life on display for strangers to dissect. Sarah stood. "May I speak?" The board chair nodded. "You may." Sarah opened her folder, took a breath, began. "I worked a solo shift the night Michael Cole came in." She kept her voice steady, clear. "The attending was in surgery. I had one nurse, a John Doe with massive trauma. I fought for 6 hours to keep him alive. During that time, he whispered my dead husband's name. Thomas. He didn't know he was talking to Thomas's widow. He just knew the name. Knew he'd failed someone. Knew he was sorry." She pulled out documents, slid them across the table. Michael Cole and Thomas Garrett worked for the same company 15 years ago. Different divisions, different cities, but connected. 7 years ago, Thomas died during a warehouse robbery. Michael was there. He tried to save him. Couldn't. The guilt destroyed everything Michael had built. Sarah presented the evidence methodically. Employment records, police reports, security footage timestamps, the anonymous 911 call. The autopsy findings showing someone had tried to move Thomas, tried to save him. The timeline proves I couldn't have known Michael before that night. Sarah's voice was firm. I'd never seen him, never heard his name. He was a stranger who happened to carry my husband's ghost. The board members studied the documents, faces unreadable. Margaret's lawyer whispered something. Margaret shook her head. Then Sarah did something she hadn't planned. Something that came from a place deeper than strategy. She talked about Michael, not as a patient, not as a benefactor, as a person. Michael Cole spent 7 years drowning in guilt. Her voice softened. He built a fortune he didn't want, lived alone, avoided connection, because he couldn't forgive himself for failing to save a co-worker, a friend, my husband. She described Michael's final hours, the desperation in his eyes when he saw her name badge, the way his hand grabbed her wrist, the recognition, the relief flooding his face like he'd been searching his entire life and finally found what he was looking for. He didn't leave his fortune to a stranger. Sarah looked at the board, at Margaret, at the reporters. He left it to the widow of the man he failed to save. It was his final apology, his last chance to make something right. I didn't know him. But he knew me. He knew what he'd taken from my life. And he tried to give something back. The room was silent. Absolutely silent. Is it appropriate? Sarah continued. Maybe not. Is it ethical by your standards? Probably not. But Michael Cole didn't care about your standards when he was dying. He cared about the woman fighting to keep him alive, the woman whose husband he couldn't save. He wanted to give her what he couldn't give her then. Security. A future. Hope. She turned to Margaret, spoke directly to her. I loved Thomas. You know I did. This money doesn't dishonor him. It honors the man who tried to save him, who failed, who spent 7 years making sure Thomas's family survived anyway. Margaret's face crumbled. The anger that had sustained her for 3 years drained away. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Her lawyer touched her arm. Margaret shook her head. Couldn't speak. Sarah addressed the board again. You can fire me. You can rule this unethical. But I'm keeping the inheritance, because rejecting it would be spitting on a dying man's final wish, and I'm done letting fear dictate my choices. Her voice grew stronger. I saved Michael Cole because that's what I do. I save people, even when they're too broken to be saved, even when the world says they're not worth it, even when it costs me everything. She picked up her folder. If that makes me unfit to practice medicine, then your hospital doesn't deserve me anyway. Sarah walked out, didn't look back, didn't wait for a response. The door closed behind her with a soft click. 3 days later, the board issued their ruling. No ethics violation. Sarah Garrett acted appropriately given the circumstances. The inheritance was unsolicited and unknown to her during patient treatment. She is reinstated with full pay. The hospital extends a formal apology. Margaret withdrew the custody petition that afternoon, appeared at Sarah's apartment that evening, eyes red, face hollow. Thomas would have wanted me to let go. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Maybe Michael did more for you than anyone realized. I'm sorry. For everything. She left. The door closed. Years of blame ending with 2 words. The hospital staff warmed slowly. Some apologized directly. Others just nodded in hallways. Respect earned through standing ground. Sarah donated $20 million to County General, created a fund for uninsured patients, named it the Cole Garrett Memorial Fund. 2 men who taught her that redemption wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying anyway. She kept the rest. Bought a small house with a yard for Daniel, trees he could climb, space to breathe, sent him to a better school, established a trust for his future, started sleeping through the night for the first time in years. One evening in early spring, Sarah drove to the cemetery, found Michael's grave, simple headstone. No family had come to the funeral. She placed flowers there, wild flowers, the kind that grew despite hard soil. Thank you. She spoke quietly. For carrying Thomas's memory. For trying. For seeing me when no one else would. Daniel asked one night why the sad man left them money. Sarah thought carefully. Because he made a mistake once, and spent his whole life trying to fix it. Sometimes that's all we can do. Try to fix what we broke. Spring came fully to County General. Sarah worked her shifts, saved who she could, lost some anyway. Went home to Daniel and a house that was finally warm. She thought about Michael sometimes. Wondered what he would have said if he'd lived. If they'd had more than 6 hours. If forgiveness had come before death. But some stories didn't get perfect endings. Some people died with words unspoken. Some gifts arrived too late to heal the giver. That was okay. Sarah had learned to live with imperfect grace. She kept working, kept fighting for patients who might not make it, kept showing up when it was hard. Because that's what Michael taught her in those final hours. That trying mattered, even when you failed. Especially when you failed. The money in her account was proof, not of scandal, not of shame, but of a broken man's final act of courage, of standing up when the world said lie down, of accepting gifts you didn't earn but somehow deserved anyway. Sarah Garrett was Michael Cole's patient for 6 hours. In that time, she fought for his life with everything she had. He spent 7 years fighting for hers. In the end, they both won. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps winding down before bed? Please subscribe to our White Coat Tales channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What resonated most with you? Sarah's courage, Michael's redemption, or the power of unexpected forgiveness? Let's connect and share our experiences together.